Welcome to Behind the Headlines, a weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Shredding paper, folding laundry. Utahns with disabilities work segregated repetitive jobs, and the U.S. Department of Justice may sue over it. Challenges abound, but migrants are saving the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and building Zion in Europe. And it's a watershed moment, what Utah's redistricting ruling means for voters' ability to change laws. Later in the program, we'll be talking with Salt Lake Tribune investigative reporter Jessica Miller and senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Right now, we bring in news columnist Robert Gehrke. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Tom.
Good morning. So let's talk about redistricting. We talked about this a little bit with Emily Anderson Stern last week, but more comments now. This is a huge ruling from the Utah Supreme Court. Remind us what they said.
Right. So remember in 2018, the state passed this ballot initiative to prohibit partisan gerrymandering. So to prohibit drawing the political boundaries to favor one party or the other. And the legislature gutted a lot of it, watered it down, made the commission, the independent redistricting commission, purely advisory, so they could ignore the recommendations from the commission, which they ended up doing, and then adopted boundaries that a large number of people feel, disenfranchised a lot of more progressive voters in Salt Lake County because it split the county into 4 districts. So the League of Women Voters and Mormon Women for Ethical Government sued. It made its way up to the Supreme Court, and the question before the court was: did the legislature overstep its bounds in undoing the will of the people? Essentially, the Constitution gives people a right to pass ballot initiatives, to change government, and the court came back and said unanimously, essentially, that if the legislature is able to undo those ballot initiatives, then it renders that constitutional right to reform government moot. So they said essentially that the legislature has to keep its hands off of ballot initiatives that reform government like this one did, which means that this goes back to the lower court, and the lower court will decide if the boundaries as they were drawn and the process that was put in place by the legislature effectively undid that initial ballot initiative. It seems likely that it will, and if it does, if the lower court does rule that, they could require the legislature to go back and redraw the map under the rubric, the framework that was in place coming out of the 2018 ballot initiative, which is a major change. It also means that any ballot initiative going forward that reforms government will end up having that same protection, that the legislature will have to, not do harm, not undo the will of the people in those ballot initiatives, provided that they do have a fundamental reform of government involved in them. So it's a big deal, and we got to see where this goes from here.
So first of all, in redistricting, if this happens, if the legislature has to redraw boundaries, could that happen before the 2026 election?
It could. There's hope that it could be done by 2026. It's a little difficult to see. We kind of have to wait and see how long it takes to get through the judicial process, for the lower court to rule, that yes, it did undo the will of the people, or no, it didn't. And then after that, there's also likely still to be an appeal, perhaps. But so then the drawing of the maps, how long does that take? Usually it takes, several months. 6 months or so, I think, is what the independent commission spent drawing these maps. You remember the independent redistricting commission, they went ahead and did the work, even though it was purely advisory. They came up with unanimous maps. So there are maps on the shelf already that could just be, taken in and ready to go, perhaps. So, but yes, the 2024 maps are going to stay in place. It's possible we'll have some by 2026. Very likely, almost certainly by 2028 if the court goes that direction. But then again, keep in mind the whole process starts over after the 2030 census, so it would be a pretty short-lived, be 4 years, maybe 6, that we would have those maps in place.
We'll look at the broader ramifications. You talked with Taylor Morgan for this story. You worked on Count My Vote initiative, which sought to require candidates to gather signatures. That ended up in as we know, a dual path compromise where candidates qualify through signatures or party nominating convention. And that, of course, is playing out with conflicts in the Republican Party right now. But he said he advised groups after the 28 flurry of initiatives and the legislature went in and changed all those. It wasn't worth it at that point to run initiatives. He says now it is.
Yeah, I heard this from a few people actually. And there are several people who are actively looking at running initiatives potentially in 2026. Um, just because now they have this protection in place. And it makes sense when I talk to Taylor, it makes sense that, why would you want to spend, it's usually upwards of $1.5 million, $2 million, $3 million to get all the signatures, to get these on the ballot. The threshold is pretty onerous to get these on the ballot. And then you got to run a campaign to try to convince the public, persuade the public to vote for it. And so it's this very arduous process. It's very expensive. And then to have it all undone by the legislature, as we saw them do in both, in the redistricting ballot initiative, in the Medicaid expansion initiative, and the medical marijuana initiative. Now, those two, they kind of left the core of it in place, I guess, because we do have medical marijuana and we do have Medicaid expansion. But, to have the legislature be able to come in and upend these if they don't like it, it's a waste of money. It's a waste of time, and nobody wants to put the time and money into that. Now he says, with this protection in place that for things, for these democratically leaning, small d democratically leaning initiative efforts, he says that there's a lot of people who are interested in doing it, and that includes things like getting rid of our partisan primaries and just having everybody on the same ballot. Top two advance to or top two or top five, one of the two, advance to the general. You could use ranked choice voting. There's people who've been looking at that for a long time. There are people looking at some campaign finance reform initiatives, some term limit initiatives. There's this group, People for Utah, that in 2022, I believe it was, we're looking at running an initiative to, sort of remake the primary process. Those initiatives have not just more chance of passage now, but also a chance of staying in place. So yeah, there's some real excitement about this going forward. And flip side of that, I guess, is I should say that the House Speaker, the Senate President both put out a statement on the day of the ruling saying this is going to turn Utah into California, because as we know, in California, they always have a bunch of initiatives because they have a much lower threshold to get on the ballot. And so, they're afraid that it's going to turn into, bedlam, where every year we have all these people running initiatives, all this outside money pours in, trying to reshape Utah laws. And they don't like that. They also don't like, frankly, losing control over the process. They like being able to have their hands on the wheel and steer the state where they want it to go. So this is going to be the tension, I think, going forward. And again, all of this assumes, I think, that the initiative protections are in place under the Supreme Court ruling, and we're still waiting to see how the lower court rules on the partisan gerrymandering issue.
Now, the legislature, it seems to me, does have a path here that you could just, as legislature, make the initiative process more and more onerous, harder and harder, next to impossible. I guess that's a path you could go.
There's been some talk of that, about exactly how they could make it more difficult. Maybe you need more signatures, et cetera. That gets a little tricky because there was a Supreme Court ruling back in, I believe, around 2000, in the Gallivan case, that said that, if it gets too onerous, if it gets too hard to get a ballot initiative on the ballot, then you've effectively nullified that same right that we're talking about, this right to reform government. So I think there is a little bit of a balancing act. They're going to have to, a fine line they're going to have to walk, let's say. Excuse me. And so I think we have to wait and see how that goes. I wouldn't be at all surprised, though, to see them trying to add some additional hurdles, some additional restrictions on this.
Thanks for telling us about this. This is a really big ruling. Just a couple of minutes left here, Robert. I want to see if you had any comments on the national scene. Republican National Convention just happened this week. Democratic Convention next month, and who knows, might have a different Democratic nominee. Maybe a launching point here, Governor Cox came out and said he's not voting for either of former President Trump or current President Biden.
Yeah, Governor Cox said he's not voting voting for either. He didn't go to the convention. Senator Romney didn't go, which isn't too surprising, I don't think. So yeah, I mean, the conventions, they used to be a big deal because this used to be where, you used to actually have some drama, some intrigue about who's going to be the vice president, who might be, if you had an open convention, you could come out with a totally different nominee. This has been pretty much baked. And so it's, all of the conventions I've been to have been kind of like this one, in that there's not much drama. It's more of a pep rally environment. The Democratic one, as you mentioned, could be really interesting because there is reporting that President Biden's going to step aside and let somebody else take the nomination. And so, that has the potential to really be a circus. So we'll watch and see how that goes. The Republican one was pretty straightforward. I mean, it was a little bit different. You had people like Hulk Hogan speaking, you had Ultimate Fighters, you had, all of these people who are not the typical lineup for a Republican convention, but I think that maybe was part of the plan. You want to reach an audience who maybe doesn't care what Mitch McConnell thinks, or, those old guard, rank and file Republicans. So I think, they again, it always ends up being a sort of a circus atmosphere, a pep rally, and this one was no different.
Well, Robert, do you have an underplayed story of the week?
I do. It's not necessarily underplayed. It just posted this morning, though. Emily Anderson Stern did some really nice work on this investigation into some harassment allegations at the Utah National Guard against the state's top National Guard officer, and the sort of delayed response, I guess, let's put it that way, from Governor Cox. He got notified of it. He met with the Adjutant General. It didn't proceed with an investigation immediately. The emails that Emily has been trying to get for a long time, and the governor's office fought her on the release of those, I think, paint a really interesting picture. And it's nuanced and it's detailed, and Emily did a really nice job on reporting on it. So I'd encourage everyone to check that out at sltrib.com. Some good accountability journalism from Emily Anderson Stern.
Yeah, that's a great story. sltrib.com. I'll just mention Mark Eddington's story, update on the Snow Canyon hiker who died. Temperature's 106 degrees. Her parents are still in the hospital. Just to highlight that for everybody to stay safe out there, hydrate, stay inside if you can. The temperatures are just really, really high. Robert Gehrke, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yep, good to be here, Tom.
Thank you. And following a break, we'll be talking with investigative reporter Jessica Miller. Here's the headline: Shredding paper, folding laundry, Utahns with disabilities work segregated repetitive jobs, and the U.S. Department of Justice may sue over it. We'll have more following this break. Behind the headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We turn next to Salt Lake Tribune investigative reporter Jessica Miller. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So here's the headline: Shredding paper, folding laundry, Utahns with disabilities work segregated repetitive jobs, and the U.S. Department of Justice may sue over it. So tell me, first of all, what programs are currently existing for people with disabilities to find work?
Yeah, so the state of Utah is required to provide employment opportunities and day services for people with disabilities. And there's a couple different departments that help do that. But what the DOJ found is that they're often relying on programs that, outsource programs, nonprofits that they're partnering with to provide job trainings or help people learn skills or give them job opportunities. But what the Department of Justice found is sometimes what that work looks like is really repetitive jobs, like shredding paper, like putting boxes together, in warehouse settings where the only people that they're really able to interact with are other people with disabilities. And the DOJ said that that's a violation of federal law that these services are supposed to be provided in a way that allow people with disabilities to still be in their community and still be a part of the community, interact with people who don't have disabilities, just do the same jobs that we're all doing in the community and not being kind of sequestered away, kind of hidden away in warehouse type settings where they're not getting that opportunity to kind of be part of the community.
Do we know the percentages, how many people with disabilities in Utah are in these sheltered programs and how many are out in the, segregated workforce?
I don't believe that was the data that they provided.
Mm-hmm.
There are about 600 people in Utah who are right now getting paid below minimum wage to do this type of work, which is allowed. There's a federal exemption that allows employers to do that. So there are hundreds of Utahns who are doing this type of repetitive work or, washing dishes, doing that sort of thing. And they're not even making $7.25 an hour, which is minimum wage here in Utah. And that just kind of depends on the program. One program we talked with, Enable Utah, they say that like about 37% of their staff or their workers get paid below minimum wage. And so they kind of have a mix of people depending on their productivity and their output who get paid more. But there are many, many hundreds of Utahns working in these type of settings.
I want to pick up that piece right now and then go back to some of the others. Below minimum wage. So the exemption is to pay sub-minimum is that so businesses can train people, right? But it's only supposed to be temporary until you're trained?
That's the idea of it. And, what I've heard talking with advocates is that they feel like sometimes people are stuck there. They feel like they can't, that it's not doing the training that it's intended to, or maybe the business has incentive to keep people in those jobs and not help them get other jobs. And when they're able to make less than minimum wage, it's based off of like output or like productivity, right? If someone who doesn't have a disability can package 10 items in an hour, maybe they want to pay $1 a package for that, they'd make $10. Someone with a disability might be packaging 4 packages an hour, and so they're getting paid $4. So it's based on output. And the idea is it's supposed to be training, and it's supposed to be temporary, but sometimes people are working, years and years and years doing these same jobs and never making more than minimum wage.
So the CEO of Enable Utah, this is this nonprofit, which I guess they use government money, but they also contract with businesses. So Gavin Hutchinson is his name. He was saying that this can be an incentive. He sees it as an incentive for people with disabilities to, I guess, improve their output.
Yeah, exactly. And he, for him, he also said that he struggles with, because he contracts with businesses, right? Like one of his contractors is Coca-Cola, and they look at expired cans and they pour out soda that's expired and they repackage the ones that are not. And so, with a contract like that, he questions whether it's fair to charge them 100% wage if his workforce is producing about 80% of the work. And so he sees it as, in business negotiations, that's a challenge. And then he does see it as with people who are working for him, that it can be a motivator of, if you produce more, then you will get paid more.
You got a dissenting opinion on this particular point from Matthew Wappett. He heads up USU's Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice. What did he say?
Yeah, he spoke very strongly against this. He calls it an exploitation of a population that can't advocate for themselves. He said that if we believe that people with disabilities are valuable and important, we should compensate them fairly. A lot of us who maybe don't have disabilities have more choices to go advocate for ourselves, to go try different jobs and figure out what we want to do. And a lot of those people who do have disabilities often are moved in, they finish high school, and then they work in a sheltered workshop, and they haven't had the same opportunities to figure out what kind of jobs they like and what kind of jobs they don't like. And that's kind of their only option.
So these sheltered workshops, I guess the main problem is you're segregated. You're not out and among the population.
Exactly. And that's what the DOJ found, right, is that they see that as a violation of federal law because these type of services, job services, the people with disabilities are supposed to be out in the community. It's supposed to be like the least restrictive place possible. And they're saying that doesn't happen in Utah because they're being moved into these sheltered workshops. Now, of course, there's people I talked with, one woman who felt so hidden away being in this type of work setting. She felt very strongly that she wanted to be out in the real world and that she wanted to interact with people. And she didn't want to be doing those type of jobs. But there are also others who find, safety and security in doing a job where they know what's going to happen every day. They know that their friends are there. They know that they're not going to be made fun of by other people in the community. And so there is a sense of security or safety for some people who actually do want to be working in these more controlled settings.
I was touched by that. There is one woman or person quoting your story who prefers the sheltered workshop. They said they were made fun of in a more segregated setting, and there in this setting, shelter workshop said, "I'm one of the smart ones. I feel better here."
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I guess that's with anyone working a job, right? I'm sure that there are people who might want to work jobs that have less interaction with people. I've chosen a career where I talk with people every day, and maybe that doesn't work for everybody. But the DOJ reports criticism is that people with disabilities aren't getting that choice, that they're not getting the support they need if they want to work a job out in the community.
CEO of Enable Utah, he says that they have these sheltered workshops, but they also try to place people in segregated or integrated settings.
Yeah, that's the goal of these programs. Like they're kind of considered like workforce services. So the goal is to maybe help you gain a skill. And they also have, like janitor services. Like they go out and clean the building, that big building, the IRS building out in Ogden. They say that they're helping people learn these job skills, and then maybe they can help them, do janitor services or some other type of job within another company, and they're more integrated into the company and, can get jobs within, local businesses or whatever opportunities there are.
So apparently, even if you're out doing janitorial work or et cetera, reading your story, sometimes even in those settings, you're segregated. You're only working with other people with disabilities.
That's what the DOJ report says. And I will say some people have kind of pushed back on that. They say, well, they're out, in public. They're out talking with people. But the DOJ found that they're kind of not. They're still pretty segregated. They still, everyone else on their workforce also are people with disabilities. And oftentimes the only people that they're interacting with who don't have a disability is their direct supervisor. And so obviously, different workforce or different janitorial crews can be different. But the DOJ found that even when they're out at these places, they're still not really interacting or enmeshed within the community.
Apparently, according to this DOJ report, some programs, people with disabilities, I guess when they're not working, I guess they're just sitting there, they're watching television, they're kind of idle. I guess the indictment here is these providers are not providing more opportunities, even apart from work.
Yeah, exactly. So the state's also required to provide day services, which is not really like, giving people jobs, but it's more gives people who have disabilities a place to go during the day and maybe gives them the assistance they need. The DOJ made a point of saying if Utahns with disabilities have the right support, they can spend their free time doing all of the things any of us like to do, go shopping, go to an exercise class, meet up with a friend. But they're saying that what these day service programs are doing is kind of putting people with disabilities in a room, having them color all day, they watch TV or they do nothing. And they're saying that again, is a violation of the law, which says that these programs are supposed to help provide these day services in the most integrated settings possible and within the community as much as possible. When you have, a large group of people who are sitting in a room who are, literally not being part of the community at all, they're saying that is violating federal law.
So as we look to solutions, Gavin Hutchison, again, the CEO of this nonprofit, Enable Utah, he worries that one of the solutions the state might seek is just to shut down these sheltered workplaces. He suggests, well, why don't we just have one-stop shopping? I guess there are several agencies in charge of providing opportunities for people with disabilities, and they don't often coordinate.
Right, exactly. Yeah, he thinks it would be there's a more effective way to run the system, and he also thinks that at least on a state level funding, that there's not a lot of incentives for businesses to hire someone with a disability, and so he thinks maybe more money could be put into incentivizing businesses to employ people with disabilities so that they are in the community more. As far as, the DOJ has threatened to sue over this if changes aren't made. And when I asked the Utah officials kind of what they're reacting to this report, they did say that they intend to work with the DOJ to kind of make changes and solve these problems, but they didn't really release a specific way that they were going to do this. They just said that they think that people with disabilities are critical citizens in the state and that they are committed to improving the service system so that people with disabilities can live their lives in the way many of us do, independently as possible with their family and friends and peers. And so the state's looking to improve, but they haven't exactly identified what that solution is going to look like at this point.
In the meantime, as I understand it, one of the problems is there's a waiting list, a pretty significant waiting list, if you want to get into some of these programs.
Right, exactly. The DOJ found problems with these programs, and that's even once people get into them. The wait list to even get these type of services is huge. People are waiting an average of 5.5 years, almost 5.5 years to get services from the Division of Services for People with Disabilities, and there's 900 people on that wait list who want help specifically getting a job. So that wait list has been around for at least a decade. Looking at some old reporting that we've done, this has been a problem that's been identified for years and years and years, that more funding is needed for these programs, and that funding hasn't come. And the wait list just continues to grow and has been growing for a long, long time.
You referenced earlier, you talked to a lady named Stacy. She has Down syndrome. She worked at a sheltered workshop, I think, before. She much prefers her work I think she works at Golden Corral.
Yeah, at the time she was working at the sheltered workshop, she was also working at Golden Corral. She did a shift on the weekend and wanted to work more. And so she went to the sheltered workshop during the week, and she was doing jobs she was sorting books. She was sorting for recycling. She separated foam from other different materials and packaged it. And she found that job to be much less satisfying than the job that she had at Golden Corral, where she was talking with people, greeting them, giving them the drinks that they ordered. Now she works at a KFC, and, she's cooking. She makes the biscuits, and that's what she wants to do with her career. She really loves food. She really loves working in the food service industry, and she wants to eventually become a chef. So she's someone who wants to be very, very much wants to be out in the world, talking with people, connecting with people. And so she really did not have a very good experience working in that sheltered workshop type setting.
Yeah, she says she wants to be valued as a person, right? She wants to have dignity as a person.
Yeah, exactly. She's obviously working in these different jobs. She has been around a lot of people who, she felt like maybe thought, you can do this work because this kind of work is beneath me. And so she really wants to be accepted and really wants to be valued for what she can do. And she feels like she has a lot of skills that can be used and that she's really eager to use in these community jobs.
So, Jessica, you have a separate story on how some Utah businesses pay less than minimum wage. We talked about this a little bit. I guess the short answer to that is there are exemptions that you can get to pay less than minimum wage.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's totally legal under federal law. You have to apply for an exemption. There are 9 businesses here in Utah that who had that exemption. Like I said, that they employ about 600 people who they pay less than minimum wage. Obviously, there's a whole form you have to fill out. One of the things that you have to do, which I kind of talked about earlier, was you have to do kind of production testing, or, seeing how long it takes to do output-based testing. So this is the type of work you do. It takes someone without a disability to do that work in X amount of time. And so they're going to pay a person with a disability that percentage of that. So it's all output based. It's based on how much work they can produce within a certain period of time. But they have to do that type of testing and submit that to the government and then get the approval to be able to pay less than minimum wage.
Now, there was legislation introduced in this past legislative session which would have gotten rid of sub-minimum wages for those with disabilities. That didn't make it out of committee.
No, that's right. And, they had advocates for people with disabilities speaking in favor of the bill, saying that this, people should get paid at least minimum wage. Again, feels like it's exploitation to not. But there was pushback from within the committee. Another lawmaker, said he'd been to Enable Utah, the place that I also went to, and he felt like the program was offering a service to people who otherwise would have no opportunity to have job training or no opportunity to earn any type of money. And so for him, it seemed like a needed service that could be eliminated if they, have to pay more money for their workers, that might not be sustainable for a business.
Well, thanks for reporting on all this. Jessica, I want to move to another story that you had this week. Here's the headline: Utah prison officials are abandoning the plan to use an untested drug combo in an upcoming execution. Here's what they want to use instead. So this is the case of Tabron Honey, who was convicted of a horrible murder. He is set right now to be executed August 8th. We'll see what happens. His attorney has sued or done a lawsuit saying that 3-drug combination is untested and might cause Mr. Honey pain, violating, I can't remember which amendment that is, cruel and unusual punishment. So the state is apparently come up with, they're going to try a different drug?
Yeah, exactly. So the state initially had said that they were going to use ketamine, fentanyl, and potassium chloride in the execution. And, ketamine's never been used in an execution before. Fentanyl's been used once. They've never been used together. Potassium chloride has been used in some executions, but the goal with the ketamine and fentanyl is to make it so that he doesn't feel pain, and then the potassium chloride will end his life. But if you don't have the right pain reliever in place, potassium chloride is an incredibly painful way to die. It feels like your veins are on fire. It's a horribly painful death. And so he's raising concerns about whether ketamine and fentanyl will sedate him enough, make him unconscious, block pain enough to block the pain that comes with potassium chloride. And so they filed a lawsuit. And then the state, kind of surprisingly yesterday, in what was just a scheduling conference, one of the attorneys with the Attorney General's office said, actually, we're trying to get this other drug. It's called pentobarbital, and it's a single drug. It's the only drug that he gets. It acts as both the pain reliever and the drug that will kill him. And it's used in many other states. It's approved as the lethal drug in at least 10 states. And it was the alternative that Honey's attorney had offered when filing this lawsuit, basically saying this 3-drug thing is so untested. There's so many questions about it. Why not just use pentobarbital, which is used in all other places where the death penalty is still used?
I guess the drug that's mentioned in the Utah law is no longer available, right? So they have to go get other drugs.
Right, exactly. The law, or the drug that's in the law and in the protocols that the prison has is not being manufactured anymore. I think it's sodium thiopental. No one in the U.S. has produced it since 2011, and it's illegal to import it, and so they can't get that drug any longer. And the law requires that they use sodium thiopental or other equally or more effective substance sufficient to cause death. So the government was arguing, basically we can get any kind of drug that sufficiently causes death similar to sodium thiopental. And so, like I said, they initially proposed these 3 drugs. They've received a ton of pushback from Honey's attorney, and so they're scrambling. I mean, there's only 3 weeks left before this execution is scheduled to try to see if they can obtain pentobarbital in time.
I guess that's so I was just going to ask you, they're trying to find pentobarbital that they don't know if they can?
Yeah, and I'm not sure what they had consulted with an unnamed pharmacist who decided that these 3 drugs were going to be the best drugs to use, and that person somehow believed that pentobarbital was unavailable, and Honey's attorney made the point in the lawsuit of it's pretty available. Other states were executing people with it last year. That's kind of their plan. It is a somewhat available drug, and so I'm not really sure why that pharmacist had initially said it would be unavailable. But yeah, they're going to try, I guess, and the state, they have to file a response to the lawsuit by tomorrow. And so the attorney indicated that hopefully by tomorrow they'll be able to say in their filings, in their response, whether it's realistic, whether they think they'll actually get that pentobarbital in time for the execution.
Yeah, I mean, it's always seems weird to talk in such even terms about executions and stuff. But I don't know if you know, Jessica, Mr. Honey. My vague memory is that he's grandfathered in and could choose execution by firing squad, but he hasn't said anything on that.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an option for him. The firing squad is not a method that can be used now unless the drugs are unavailable. So I guess it could be, there is an exception. But he is someone who is kind of grandfathered in and could have made that decision. And up to this point, he's kind of elected to not make a decision at all. Like at the sentencing hearing back in '99, I don't think the judge even asked him, which maybe they should have. And then more recently, when he's been asked, his attorney has said, he doesn't have the information to make that decision because, up until very recently, the state hadn't said what the drugs were. And so he kind of thought, maybe I would choose firing squad if the alternative was these untested drugs. But so he hasn't made a determination. And so because of that, it defaults to lethal injection because that's the method that we're currently using in the state.
So is the next hearing July 30th? Is that what I read?
That's the next hearing for this lawsuit. So he kind of has 2 kind of last chances, I guess, to avoid execution. One is this lawsuit. The other is a commutation hearing where he'll go before the parole board and basically ask them to spare his life, to convert the death penalty sentence to a life without parole sentence. That's happening next week, so that will be about 2.5 days next week. His attorney will present witnesses. The state will, I'm assuming, probably just go through the details of the crime again, kind of the heinousness of it, and then the parole board will decide whether to grant him clemency. It's a very, very rare hearing in Utah. I think there's only been 2 before this in a couple of decades. The last one was in 2010 with Ronnie Lee Gardner. They didn't grant his petition, and of course he was executed by firing squad that year.
Well, thanks, Jessica, for telling us about all of this. Investigative reporter Jessica Miller from the Salt Lake Tribune has been with us, and you're listening to Behind the Headlines, weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune. Jessica, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams, and this part of the program, we turn to Salt Lake Tribune senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Peggy, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So you had a special report looking at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Central Europe. Very interesting to see what's going on there. And I think one of I guess a good place to start here, I'll just read this. European-style Mormonism, contrary to conventional wisdom, is not dying but growing. I guess that's due in large part to immigrants.
It's true that the continent has had a wave of immigrants in the past decade, but especially in the past few years. And those are people who already are misplaced from their homes, a little adrift, and are more likely to be open to joining a community like the Latter-day Saints, whereas lots of Europeans already have a faith or they're pretty settled and not so interested in switching, which means these congregations, these LDS congregations in Europe, are a mix of, for example, Germans and Africans. We dropped into a congregation in Hamburg, Germany, which at one time had about 120 active members. When we went there in May, there were about 40 in attendance, of which, about a half were Africans. So the service was the two speakers who spoke English, and then it was translated into German for the Germans. So that was pretty interesting, and that's happening all over the continent.
So one of the spokesmen for the church's Central European area, he says these immigrants are saving the church in Europe. I think maybe it was him or somebody else in the story compared it to very early church history where immigrants from England and Denmark and so forth, quote unquote, saved the church by immigrating to the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. The man, Denise Adriano, is from Portugal, but he's living in Frankfurt, Germany. He made that point that in the 19th century, immigrants from Europe came to Utah and built up the church's membership here. And now these immigrants are moving to these different countries of Europe and sort of building up the church there. Because, as I said, the Europeans, not a lot of them are joining the church. So for these immigrants, but I mean, it was fascinating because there are immigrants that are Iranian, Farsi speaking in Hungary.
So I have to include this. This is maybe my favorite part of the whole story. You talked to a fellow named Ralph Gehrke, who's assistant communication director for that church's area. His grandmother was from Poland. She immigrated to Germany.
Yes.
And her ministers, her home teachers, tell me about them.
As he told it to us in a Mormon Land podcast, he said it almost sounds like a joke. One had a wooden leg and the other was blind. And his grandmother lived about 25 kilometers away from the nearest ward house. And so these two men, wooden leg, other was blind, the guy with the wooden leg, and they had to go on bicycles. They didn't have cars. This is the 1950s. The guy with the good wooden leg would sing or talk the entire time while they were riding their bicycles, so the blind guy would know where to go.
Yeah, amazing.
Quite devotion.
Right. So in your story, Peggy, you talked to several people about integrating. You say you have Germans, longtime Germans, then you have these, say, African immigrants coming in, and most people you talk to say they are integrating well, but they have to work at it.
Yeah, it's not without its problems, of course. Language is a big thing, so that sometimes when these new converts go to a ward and they don't speak German or they don't speak French or whatever, but they speak Spanish or Portuguese, they after the main service, which is a sacrament meeting service, they may go off and form little subgroups of their own, which is natural. But, I don't want to say there were no problems. The guy in Belgium said, that there were some problems. But it's pretty remarkable that they're doing this.
Yeah, I think the guy in Belgium, he said, I think this was him, exuberant, lengthy testimonies and talks, constant need of translation, misunderstood doctrines, lack of punctuality. So it's, some cultural things and I guess some things with new converts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So another part of this is very interesting. Young people. There isn't a critical mass of, if you're in the church, you want to marry somebody in the church, not enough fellow converts to go around.
That is true. I talked to the spokesperson about that. I said, "What are the young people supposed to do? Should they go to BYU?" And the answer is, well, that isn't really a solution because university education in most European countries is essentially free. So to go even at a relatively inexpensive American university, that's a big financial problem for these Europeans. So they're trying to think of what to do about it, try to have more youth activities or getting together. But it is a problem.
Another part of this was interesting. You talked to several women who are part of leadership. Tell me about that.
Yeah, in Europe, in the LDS Church in Europe, they've created a position for women that is essentially area organization advisors. So each area has an area authority, which is a man, priesthood holding man, and women are not in general obviously in those positions, but these women were called as area organization advisors. 3 years ago, they started this program. It was kind of experimental, and with like a handful of women. Now there are 93 of them serving around the world, none in the United States, but everywhere else. And I talked to one of these women, Julia Wandra, and she said, we work with the area presidency, and then they become essentially leaders of the Relief Society for Adult Women, Young Women for Teens, the primary, and they give that feedback to the men, and they feel empowered in a way that women haven't had that kind of leadership in the past.
Another section in your story, Peggy, interesting. The people you talked to pointed out that Latter-day Saints are relatively invisible on the religious landscape. Catholics, other Protestant religions, much larger. And so they emphasized that they're doing, I guess, interfaith conversations, partnerships, partnering on events and such.
A lot of interfaith activities. Both Denise and Rolf mentioned to me all this interfaith activity, and it was fascinating. For example, Denise told me that last year when the Catholic Church had a big youth meeting in Portugal, in Lisbon, the Latter-day Saint young people were involved in a choir, an interfaith choir. So they actually got to go to Lisbon and participate in this Catholic World Youth Day. And they're doing that they're much, much more involved in interfaith activities than lots of American Latter-day Saints. And it's a way of seeing commonality and building networks and bridges. I thought it was an interesting way to go.
Well, a fascinating story, Peggy. Anything else you'd like to say about it?
No, I mean, I have to say that I visited 9 countries, and there's just something different about European Mormonism that just seems a little looser, a little more open. I reported, for example, that lots of Latter-day Saint politicians in Europe are very left-leaning, which is unusual in the U.S. Not that there aren't any, but they definitely are in the minority. I think because Latter-day Saints are in such a small minority, they really have to reach out to others and to be pretty welcoming. And it looks, at least from the outside, that's exactly what they're doing.
Well, Peggy Fletcher traveled around several European countries reporting on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Central Europe. We've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Peggy, thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for listening. You've been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I hope you'll be with me again next time. Thanks for listening.